Live from Singapore, this is Insight with me, Haslinda Amin, a show where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis. Korean investigators focus on a bird strike and landing gear failure as they look into the cause of the country's deadliest passenger jet crash. We'll get analysis from aviation writer Jeffrey Thomas. Meanwhile, Korea's political turmoil takes a new turn, with investigators requesting an arrest warrant for impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol. We'll get more on the impact for investors and the country's governance. And the state funeral to be held for former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who's died at his Georgia home aged 100. We look back at his dramatic time in office and his humanitarian legacy. Our top story today, the deadliest civil aviation accident in South Korean history. 179 people were killed on Sunday in a fiery plane crash after a Boeing 737-800 aircraft operated by Jeju Air crashed at Muan International Airport. Seoul is now considering special inspections of Boeing 737-800 jets. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg Asia transport reporter Danny Lee and aviation analyst Jeffrey Thomas. Danny, let's start with you. It's hard to determine really the cause of the accident. What's the latest on the investigation so far?
Yeah, the authorities are focusing on the bird strike that took place in the final minutes before the plane's landing in Muan. And there are so many things around that which are so significant and of interest to investigators, such as the mayday call by the pilots and the warning from the airport and the air traffic control tower of the risk of bird strikes in the minutes up to the landing. And so when we saw this dramatic footage play out over the last 24 hours of the plane barely landing, sliding at high speed into the end of the runway, into an embankment, this fiery wreck, the destroyed plane, it's just a little wonder that only 2 people survived, 179 people died. But with the landing gear not deployed and a possible issue of that as well, that the investigators need to assess. We also heard this morning, though, that from the Transport Ministry in South Korea, that they will be looking at whether there was any power problems with the aircraft, and that really, for them to determine, will only emanate from once they extract the black box recorders, one of which is damaged. So, there is still a lot of crucial evidence that they need to try and obtain, and let's hope that they can, in order to try and find some answers quickly into what happened, into what is South Korea's worst civil aviation crash in the country.
As you said, Danny, the black boxes hold key information on the final moments. One of them is damaged. Can it still be analyzed?
I mean, authorities are confident that it can be. They are looking at the extent of the damage at the moment. I think the question, though, is to what extent is it damaged, and therefore, if it is, then it may need to be taken abroad for more specialist extraction, likely the US, where they've handled many of these types of severely damaged black boxes. So that's something that the authorities need to be looking into then, will be looking into, and hopefully the information that can be extracted from that.
And as we speak, Danny, we'd like to show those live pictures from Muan. A group memorial center has been set up in Muan to honor the victims of a plane crash that we've been talking about that killed 179 people. I'm just wondering, Danny, this is, of course, a Boeing plane. What have we heard from Boeing?
Boeing was very swift to offer its condolences and its support to any investigation on Sunday. And as is always standard practice, the authorities have invited Boeing, the engine maker, and also other relevant parties, including the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, because this was a U.S.-made plane, in order to be party to the investigation. And so by getting all these experts together, they can get a bigger ramp-up of this investigation, which hopefully they can find some answers very quickly.
Denny Lee, hang tight. Let's bring in our guest, Jeffrey Thomas. Jeffrey, what's your take on this? We know that investigations are focusing on that bird strike. Is that a possibility? Because we've heard from some experts saying it is unlikely to be the cause of this crash.
I think the bird strike is fundamental to this tragic crash. Did the bird bring down, or did the birds bring down the aircraft by themselves? Well, no. But what it appears has happened is that the bird strike has started a domino effect, a cavalcade, if you like, of disasters in the cockpit. Because, first of all, as Danny said, air traffic control warned the pilots of this aircraft at 8:57. They warned them of a flock of birds. At 8:58, the pilots called a mayday, and we have vision of a bird strike on the right engine of the aircraft. Now, it wouldn't have been a single bird. There would have been a multiple bird strike. And at the same time, which I think is very, very important to this investigation, at the very same time, the ADSB data, now that's the air traffic control electronic data that's sent out by the aircraft to air traffic control, telling the air traffic control of the location, the speed, the altitude, direction of the aircraft. That data, which is what air traffic control tracked planes with, stopped. Now, that indicates there was an electrical failure. At that same time as the mayday is called, there's been an electrical failure of some kind because the ADSB data has stopped. Now, the aircraft was approaching 01 runway, which is there's a single runway there, south to north. That landing was aborted and the aircraft was directed to go around to the north and approach from the north to the south on runway 19. Now, we also know that when the aircraft was approaching the runway, the undercarriage was not down, and nor were the flaps set. Now, if you're coming into land, you have your flaps set, and there's about 8 settings on a 737. The maximum is about 40 degrees of flaps, so you can clearly see the flaps out, slowing the aircraft down, and also the undercarriage is not down. So this seems to indicate that the pilots were dealing with a whole multitude of failures. Why? We just simply don't know at this stage. And then they landed halfway down the runway, or even 2/3 down the runway, and as we've all seen, exited the runway and hit the localizer building or structure,
right,
which was 1,000 feet beyond the end of the runway.
So, Jeffrey, a cocktail of factors probably came into play here. From your own observations, do you think the standard aviation guidelines were observed in this case?
Well, the standard aviation guidelines as far as the airport layout is concerned, yes, I've looked them up. The localizer structure was, and for viewers, these localizer structures have to be at either end of the runway because this is what guides the aircraft in. So yes, this one did have a wall attached to it, but they're normally very robust structures. So if the aircraft didn't hit the wall, it would have hit the localizer steel poles, and there's a multitude of those. And so it still would have blown up, whether it hit a brick wall or hit the localizer itself. But they're essential, and they were situated 1,000 feet beyond the end of the runway at both ends. So they complied completely with international standards. As far as the operation of the airline is concerned and the operation of air traffic control, we just don't know. But I think that cascading failures have put these pilots under immense amount of pressure, and I think they've done whatever they could to get the aircraft down with multiple failures.
Some say that from the pictures that we've seen, the aircraft could be maneuvered. Is there a sense that perhaps, the pilots could have taken more time, dumped more fuel, explored other options? What's the sense you're getting?
Well, we know from the video we've seen that one engine had obviously a bird strike of some kind. Did the other engine have some kind of a bird strike? So we assume that one engine was not producing any power, but maybe the other engine was damaged and was producing reduced power. It may well have been the pilots absolutely had no options because they had lost one engine, the other engine was degraded by the bird strike. Therefore, they had no options. They had simply had no options, and they couldn't land in the ocean. They didn't have the time to do that. So. It's like the miracle on the Hudson, except this wasn't a miracle. This was a tragedy. That's possibly how you could characterize this.
Some had talked about how perhaps on the ground more could have been done, that phone path, for instance, could have been laid, but it wasn't. What's your take on what happened there? A Mayday call was made.
Well, a Mayday call was made, absolutely, but I think the time span between the Mayday call and the landing was approximately 4, maybe 5 minutes at best. Now, to get the fire tenders out to the runway and lay foam, they simply couldn't do it inside 4 or 5 minutes. It would take them a minute and a half to get activated. They just simply wouldn't have time to be able to do that. So my sense is that this aircraft was suffering one engine failure and possibly degraded engine performance on the other engine. Therefore, there just simply wasn't time. Because if there was time, then the pilots would have flown away from the airport into a holding pattern, cranked the landing gear down, because the landing gear can be cranked down. The fire trucks would have laid foam on the runway. You would have had all sorts of emergency services in place for then a more controlled and much safer landing. There wasn't time. I think we're going to find this was a time issue and an engine degradation issue.
Jeffrey, we talked about how it hit a brick wall before, exploding into flames. I'm just wondering, why was there a brick wall at the end of that runway? Is that a valid question to be asking?
Well, look, it is absolutely a valid question, and many people are asking that question. But first of all, the brick wall was part of the localizer structure. Now, the localizer is what guides aircraft into landing. So you've got localizers at both ends of the runway. So they've got to be there. And so if it didn't hit the brick wall, it would have hit the steel localizer itself. And that would have done just as much damage as the brick wall did to the aircraft. Now, beyond this, you've got a road and a ditch. So if it didn't hit the wall and the localizer, it would have hit the ditch and then the road. Again, it would have broken up because it was traveling at very high speed. The problem started with the aircraft landing so far down the runway. If it had touched down at the beginning of the runway, then the aircraft would have just come to a halt probably half to 2/3 of the way down the runway, and everybody probably would have got out. Unfortunately, and again, we get back to the controllability of the aircraft, what problems the pilots were facing. For whatever reason, it landed halfway to 2/3 down the runway and careered into this structure, which normally would be perfectly safe to be where it was without interfering with anything.
Jeffrey, I want to bring in back our reporter, Danny. Danny,
Sure.
We know that this is a 787 plane, and we know that it is a model that's being used widely in the world, and it has good safety standards, right?
Yeah, the 737 being a very popular and also a best-selling plane, and as a single-aisle jet, there are 4,000 of these 737-800 aircraft in service. And so, given the propensity or high number of these aircraft flying around the world, this is just a small blot, which obviously magnifies into something a lot bigger just because of this incident. But, given how safe overall aviation has been in 2023, where there were no large civil aviation jetliner crashes, clearly 2024 has been a nadir, basically, with, at the start of the year, we had Japan Airlines with its collision on the runway with a Coast Guard plane. And even just last week, where we had an issue with the Azerbaijan Airlines plane as well. So there's been a lot of big and small incidents, events and accidents that, has become a big talking point for the public, particularly around the safety of aviation.
So the 737 has a track record. I'm just wondering if South Korea has a good track record when it comes to aviation as well. So 737 jets are great. South Korean aviation track record just as great?
They've got South Korea is a very mature aviation market, and in its modern history, very, very safe. Clearly, in the historic past, there have been previous accidents and crashes, but its standards over time have improved immeasurably, and you can see that through the quality of its airlines and the skills, particularly not just in operating airlines, but in maintenance, for example. So, incredibly safe. And so, clearly the authorities, given this fatal accident being the biggest in the country for civil aviation, just want to take a good look to reassure the public that things are absolutely okay, and particularly by taking a look at this particular type of aircraft that will be inspected, over 100 of these in the country.
Jeffrey, final question to you. I mean, as we look to 2025, what do you think is the biggest challenge for the industry, the aviation industry?
That question to me?
Yes, Jeffrey.
Sorry. Okay. Look, the biggest challenge for the industry, for as far as safety is concerned, is landing accidents. This is the biggest killer of travellers. Over 45% of fatalities involve the landing phase. Most of them involve overruns, and typically on runways that are short, runways that are not compliant with international standards, with the required overrun, with pilots who land 2/3 the way or 1/3 the way down the runway, not landing in the right spot. There's a lot of challenges in that area, and certainly landing accidents, we've got too many of them, and this needs to be addressed.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for that. Jeffrey Thomas, founder and aviation analyst at Jeffrey Thomas On Air, and of course our very own Bloomberg News aviation reporter Danny Lee. Well, still ahead this hour, South Korea has now impeached 2 leaders in the last 2 weeks. We get more on the impact of the political turmoil with Sun Byung Park from the University of British Columbia. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
Today, America and the world, in my view, lost a remarkable leader. What I find extraordinary about Jimmy Carter, though, is that millions of people all around the world, all over the world, feel they lost a friend as well, even though they never met him. And that's because Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds.
U.S. President Joe Biden and the legacy of Jimmy Carter. Carter died at the age of 100 at his home in Plains, Georgia. His term in the White House was marked by significant achievements, including brokering a peace accord between Israel and Egypt, as well as economic turmoil at home. Bloomberg's David Weston takes a look back at his life.
President Carter came to office in the wake of Watergate and Vietnam with a commitment to right the ship of state.
President Carter brought back to government honesty, integrity, and faith in government. He ran as a candidate on a government as good as its people, and he truly did deliver that.
I think President Carter in many ways was ahead of his time in terms of his emphasis, for example, on human rights, in terms of his thinking about alternative energy, in terms of his role in the Middle East peace agreements that he put together. And we all know that his ex-presidency, which has been such a long one, has been graced by remarkable contributions to humanity by former President Carter. I think right now, he is seen very favorably. I'm really happy to see that because he's a very special man.
One of President Carter's biggest challenges was energy in the face of the second Arab oil embargo.
Well, he was president during a very challenging time. As you recall, there was the oil embargo, which drove oil prices up dramatically. That became a catalyst for the highest inflation that we had really since the war, and probably even before that. And so he had to take some very tough fiscal measures. He did appoint Paul Volcker, who, by very much tightening monetary policy, caused a recession, which certainly was not an easy thing for President Carter to run through.
He was the first person to talk about energy and how we had to start looking at renewable energy plans and how our country could invest and incentivize in that area. And I don't know if you remember, but he had a solar panel on the White House, which when he left, President Reagan took down. But he also had fuel mileage standards and, really realized, I think, way before anybody else that we had to start thinking about what climate and what it was doing to our planet.
But as influential as Jimmy Carter was as president, he will be remembered every bit as much for what he did after he left office.
The thing, though, that I think is absolutely most notable about President Carter is we can all debate the relative merits of any individual president's term, but I think it's inarguable that President Carter is the single most impressive, most successful, and most to be admired ex-president in the history of our nation. This is a man who took the responsibilities of being a visible public figure incredibly seriously and was a role model to all of us.
And you can read more about President Carter's legacy on the Bloomberg website and terminal. Bloomberg subscribers go to DBGO. It's also available on mobile in Bloomberg Anywhere app. You can customize your settings, by the way, so you only get news on the industries and assets you care about. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. Well, South Korean assets are in focus amid continued political uncertainty and a fatal plane crash over the weekend. Despite a rebound today, the Kospi is the worst performing major Asian index this year. Stocks were under pressure even before the brief imposition of martial law this month. Avril Hong has more. Avril.
Yeah, Has. I mean, let's talk about what we're seeing across Korean assets today before we rake through how they've been performing since the start of the year. As you say, the Kospi is rebounding today and it's snapping a 3-session losing streak. It's led by biotech healthcare stocks on the last trading day of the year as financial authorities, along with the government, issued a joint statement. They're, suggesting that they will do their best to help to stabilize markets. But it is hard to see how this is a convincing turnaround, as we know how Korean assets across the board were among the worst performing already in the region, even ahead of that brief imposition of martial law, as you say. And this really surrounding the growth concerns in the country, which started showing up in slowing in exports numbers. These concerns certainly compounded as Trump is set to take office. So stocks already pairing the gains on the Kospi of about 1% earlier in the session. flip the board, I wanted to put things into further perspective for you. If you look at the smaller cap gauge in Korea, for example, the KOSDAQ, we've seen it lose about 24% already so far this year. Its worst performance is 2022. Take into context what we're seeing in the Korean won, already the worst performer this year in the region, and it's a worst performance since 2008. Many analysts already pointing out that it's likely to remain under pressure in the first quarter of next year, given the greenback strength. Think about the political vacuum in the country and also the concerns surrounding the country's fiscal position. So not looking great across the board. Has.
That's right. Korean won down, 12% and change. Avril Hong, thank you. The latest now on the political chaos in South Korea. Investigators are seeking a warrant to arrest President Yoon Suk-yeol after he failed to appear for questioning for the third time over his martial law declaration. If it's granted, Yoon could become the first president in the country's history to be arrested while in office. Finance Minister Choi Suk-moh is currently the interim leader after acting President Han Duck-soo was also impeached, deepening the political crisis. Let's discuss the political and market implications with Sun Ryung Park, a political science PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. Also with us, Polka Mishra, partner at Javelin Wealth Management. Good to have you both with us. Let's start with the political environment here. I mean, it sinks the political situation in Korea even more. Isn't that right?
Yeah, actually, it's been aggravating, and there are key points about whether, arrest warrant will be issued against Yoon. And as you may have heard, acting President Han Duck-soo was impeached, which aggravates the political tension between ruling party and opposition party. And another issue is about whether Yoon's martial law declaration was against the constitutional and any legal standards and so on and so forth. So, yeah, this is where Korea is standing at now.
Sun, I'm just wondering, we have the finance minister now standing in as the president. I mean, what are the chances that he too could be impeached? What are we hearing? What are the indications from the opposition?
Actually, the opposition Democratic Party has lowered its level of pressure against the current acting president and finance minister Choi, because they know that Choi is considering the appointing judges at the Constitutional Court, which is one of the key contentions between the ruling party and the opposition party. So I'd like to say that the likelihood of impeaching against Choi is not that high, but it really depends on the situation around the Constitutional Court and so on and so forth.
Isn't it true, though, even if he is not impeached, I mean, holding the finance ministry position along with the president position, it's a big ask for the man.
Yeah, that's true. Another issue is that, like I said before, whether the Corruption Investigation Office for High-Ranking Officials, CIO in short, is seriously considering filing an arrest warrant for President Yoon. So if they really issued arrest warrant against him, the current acting president Choi will be in a very difficult situation. And also the opposition Democratic Party is warning that they will do impeachment again and again and again for all the cabinet members if the ruling party will not support their plan. So, yeah, this is a very dire situation.
Sun, hang tight. I want to bring in Polka Mishra into the conversation. This is not looking good for Korean assets. We heard from Avril earlier how the Korean won is the worst performer in Asia this year, down 12%. The KOSDAQ, worst Asian benchmark this year. I mean, we can expect losses ahead in 2025.
Yes, not looking good, and it couldn't be worse timing for Korea as well. I think Korean won is now at a low since 2009. Korean economy wasn't in a great shape at this point anyway. Growth was slowing down. They just about managed to get inflation under check, and we saw the back-to-back rate cuts, which were a surprise, which BOK delivered. to help the economy. Exports are slowing down, so this could not come at a worse timing, and is going to put further pressure on the Korean won, especially given what Fed announced recently and the pause that they're going to take.
And with the won under so much pressure, it puts a lot of pressure on the BOK to perhaps dial down on its rate cuts.
Yeah, absolutely. I must admit that so far BOK has been the only impressive story in this whole saga. Your interview with Governor Keith, they said the right things, that we're going to support the market, we'll do whatever is needed to provide the liquidity. So that's helped a bit, but they just have so many levers to play with. They cannot do too much. So yes, it puts them in a very difficult position just when we thought that they had some control to help revive the economy and arrest this the slowness in the growth that started to creep in.
We keep hearing it again and again, how the economy needs help, but financial stability is now an issue. You know, economy versus financial stability. You got to imagine financial stability will be the priority.
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. Economy will be second. If there is no financial stability, investor confidence is gone. It's very difficult to bring it back, especially given what we anticipate is going to happen next year with trade tensions and all. You're going to have to deal with a lot as an economy anyway. And if your markets are not attractive, if the markets shake investor confidence, then you can write off the next whole year.
Son, just to continue our conversation on the political scene, we've heard from Yoon himself saying that he will fight the case in court. I mean, what are the chances of that? What are the chances that he may be successful?
I actually don't think that success rate for President Yoon is not that high, because speaking of the next hearing under the Constitutional Court scheduled for January 3rd, I think it'll be the venue for President Yoon and his attorney to challenge his rebellion charge. The President Yoon and his attorney argue that the declaration of martial law did not violate any constitutional or legal standards, and if it did, the violations were not severe enough to justify impeachment. But the problem is that Constitutional Court judges, the current 6 members, they actually see that the martial law declaration was a grave concern, and so. Yeah, like I said, the success rate for President Yoon is not that high, and the next hearing will be kind of the battle about the legitimacy of declaration of martial law.
How do you see these playing out, Son? I mean, what are you most concerned about?
I actually see that this turmoil does really present a critical task for Korea's democratic resilience, because the handling of this impeachment and leadership crisis will shape the public trust in its government for the next few years, maybe for a decade. And again, the country has been deeply divided between ruling party and opposition supporters, and the leadership vacuum risks delaying urgent decisions amid economic challenges and security threat, as we have heard. And another issue is that with no clear plan to address the shifting U.S. policy under the upcoming Trump administration, and the Korean won at its worst since the global financial crisis. So I'd like to say that stakes are very, very high. So if mishandled, this crisis could deepen polarization and undermine South Korea's economic and global standing.
People talk, as you said, about the polarized democracy. I'm just wondering, people also talk about a revenge cycle. How concerning is that?
It's actually true, yeah. And now, in Korean political arena, now the election has become the matter of revenge. And if a ruling party takes into the power, and the opposition party will have to concern about their kind of survival. So this revenge cycle has been in the history of Korean politics, and like I said, it has only aggravated the polarization between the conservative and the progressive, or the right and the left. And this kind of ideology has been linked to North Korean issue. So they are all mingled and very complicated issue. So it only adds to the complexity.
Polka, the political situation looks pretty dire. Does it mean that you stay away from Korean assets in 2025, or are there opportunities to buy?
So we have actually stayed away from Korea, but that's for economic reasons. I think now the political reasons are there. Look, market can be forgiving for political shenanigans. The concern here is if this continues to drag on. If it was a 6-hour martial law, president resigned, apologized, and we moved on, the markets would have ignored it. Yes, there would have been short-term volatility, but the problem now is that from what we are hearing, it seems to be dragging on, and it's becoming very personal, it's becoming very extremely political, and I think economy is not on the minds of the people who are creating this havoc. Having said that, yes, we'll watch very carefully. There's always an opportunity. The way I look at it is that once the dust settles, hopefully sooner rather than later, we may come across a market which is now looking fairly priced. The drop in the market, we've seen the won drop, it starts to look cheap because of that. I think Korean government has announced a mega investment in technology and high-tech sector. So in a global environment where the good markets are looking excessively expensive, Korea may present those opportunities, but it really depends on how long this lasts.
And some are expressing some concerns about perhaps provocation from North Korea. How are you assessing that possibility? Might Kim Jong-un see this as an opportunity to do something?
Currently, I think things are managed, but I actually don't know how he perceived this crisis as opportunity on the night of December 3rd when Yoon declared the martial law. And as we all know, like that, the President Biden, U.S. President Biden was kept in the dark about this martial law declaration. So I think the really important issue is whether the U.S.-Korea alliance and the trust between two countries will be maintained, and if that is, maintained in a certain level, solid level, and maybe we can prevent or we can deter any potential provocation from North Korea.
Sun, thank you so much for being with us. Sun Ryung Park of the University of British Columbia, Polka Mishra of Javelin Wealth Management is sticking around. Now, still ahead, Donald Trump weighs in on the looming TikTok ban in the U.S., asking the Supreme Court to put that on hold before he takes office. More on that next. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. President-elect Donald Trump has thrust himself into the high-stakes fight over the fate of TikTok in the U.S. He's urging the Supreme Court to pause a law that would ban the social media platform unless it's sold by its Chinese parent company. Trump's lawyer said justices should give Trump time to resolve the dispute, since only he possesses the consummate deal-making expertise, electoral mandate, and the political will to negotiate a resolution. Well, Polka Mishra is still with us, partner at Javelin Wealth Management. Well, it does look like he is the negotiator. He wants to negotiate. He knows what he wants out of China. Yeah, that's the reason why he's doing this.
He loves his deals, doesn't he? And actually, it's interesting to see that despite of all the noise that he makes, actually he wants deals. He doesn't want animosity as much as he wants to strike his deal. He wants to be the guy who comes up with a solution, and personal favoritism is coming in play. He loves TikTok, so he wants to do something about it, despite talking about a blanket tariff on everything Chinese. So going to be a very interesting year, 2025.
The Trump themes are coming through really well. How are you positioning for 2025?
So it's going to be a very interesting year. So we are not positioning now because, Haslinda, there's a lot that's going to be said. we need to, at that point, unpack what's actually going to be done, what they're serious about. So, for example, Fed being called expensive or overstaffed doesn't matter because the government is not funding the Fed. It's just that the people don't know that. So as the policies come in, and just TikTok is a perfect example, that a lot may be said, but a lot less may be done. So we have to unpack at that point. And for long-term investors like us, we will have to be a lot more reactive next year and a lot more selective in various markets based on the reality of the tariffs, the tax cuts, and what actually gets through the Congress.
However you unpack, it does seem that U.S. exceptionalism will continue in 2025. So the U.S. is the place to be, or at least one of the places to be.
Yes.
The reason that the question is, what do you buy? Do you still continue to play the Mag 7?
Yes, we do. U.S. exceptionalism continues. The economy is strong. It continues to surprise on the upside. Whether inflation will pick up or not remains to be seen. Yes, we are continuing on the Mag 7. We think the large cap theme is still relevant, given Trump policies and the mindset. We think growth stocks will still continue to benefit. Apart from the tech Mag 7, what we also feel is that it's still going to be the producers of AI rather than the consumers or users of AI. But we feel that some of the ancillary sectors may start to benefit. For example, utilities, data centers. That's where we can look for more opportunities. We are not bullish on small caps. They will definitely continue to struggle. We're still in a very high interest rate environment.
Some say, though, 2024 being the AI year, 2025 might just be quantum computing.
Yes, it is very much possible. There's more investment going into the sector. And I think a lot of the naysayers, including us, who thought that, oh, all right, ChatGPT came through, but AI is still a long way to go, were a bit afraid to say, okay, it's not quantum computing. And not just in the US, but we've seen that in Taiwan. We're seeing that in Japan as well, that investment is going in. So it may offer that theme. But from a liquid market investment point of view, we have to see which stocks, which companies are actually investing and have enough tangible investments as well as exposure to those sectors before we invest in that sector.
Olka, we know sentiment is pretty much driven by the Fed.
Yes.
What it does with rates and how it counters inflation, which continues to be sticky, closer to 3 rather than to 2. You got to wonder, at some point, perhaps, if the data continues to be strong, we could see the Fed raising rates or pausing for a very long time.
It'll definitely have to pause for a very long time. I don't think Fed is driving the agenda. I think Donald Trump is driving the agenda. Interestingly, this time round, Jerome Powell did mention that they have to consider the policies of the incoming administration, whereas in the past, they've always mentioned Fed is independent, we are data-driven, we do not care who comes into office. So yes, there should be a pause. Actually, the economy is strong. Labor market is in a good place. Unemployment is steady. So they should, from a U.S. perspective, a pause makes an absolute sense.
You see a long pause. How long is long?
For us, we always thought that more than 2 rate cuts in 2025 would not be possible or would not be practical. So we think first half of the year, don't think Fed will have to do much. It is very much possible that we may end up with a rate hike, but that depends on what sort of tariffs are imposed. If the tariffs are specific, then it will not be as inflationary. But if the tariffs are broad-based, 10% across the whole geography, then definitely there'll need to be a rate hike there. And it creates a much more difficult situation for the rest of the central banks.
Some say the U.S. market is the only game in town, but not really, right? If you take a look at Asia, for instance, India, Japan hold great potential.
Absolutely, and not just India, Japan, there are a couple of our conviction positions, but also if you look at Indonesia, Malaysia, even Philippines, these are economies that have their inflation well under control. In Indonesia, it is at the lower end of what their target is, so they actually have a bit of room to play. These are economies that are actually going through an inflection point, so there's a lot more opportunity in Asia. Just that we have to be a lot more selective in Asia. A broad-brushed overall Asia allocation may not work because of all the trade tensions that we expect to happen.
Some of the economies that you mentioned, like Indonesia, are pretty much dependent on how the dollar is doing. We're seeing a very strong dollar. I think it's the strongest in more than 10 years.
Yes.
I mean, might that impact appetite for Indonesian assets?
So for some assets, yes. For others, no. So we have to be selective. That's why I said we have to be a lot more selective.
So what would you look at Indonesia?
So Indonesia will benefit if tariffs come in play. If the anti-China rhetoric is true, then Indonesian manufacturing is going to benefit because companies need to look for alternatives. Vietnam is already has been a beneficiary, but it is being tagged as a China proxy. So countries like India, Indonesia end up being net beneficiaries. You'd look at manufacturing. You'd look at, say, for instance, in India, even though the currency will weaken, you look at the IT sector because IT services will become a lot cheaper for even the US markets. So we'll have to be very sector specific in all these markets.
How about China? An underperformer in 2025, might it surprise next year?
So finally, it seems like the government has relented and is doing what the economy needs as opposed to their long-term core agenda. The focus on consumer spending it's an absolute welcome change, and it is actually against their fundamental beliefs. That's not what they want to do. And we talked about it last time as well, that it's more important to see whether they're able to execute on these policies, and they've finally done that, or they're finally doing it. There's a lot more to be done. So it's going to be a reset year for China. It's not going to be a sudden turnaround because the problems are very, very deep. But we talked, for example, I think a couple of days back, yesterday, it was announced that the local governments will have more flexibility in what they use the special bond for. Now, those are the kind of changes that we need because that allows them to execute on those policies as opposed to just a broad brush approach, no clarity and too many restrictions. So implementation became harder.
All right, Polka, we have to leave it there. Polka Mishra, Javelin Wealth Management. Before we go, let's do a check on how Asian benchmarks are doing under some pressure on the back of the losses we saw in the U.S. on Friday, led pretty much by tech. Let's take a look at how those benchmarks are doing right now. Of course, we're also keeping an eye on Korea on the back of what we saw over the weekend with that plane crash. MSCI Asia Pac Index down 0.4% losses for the Hang Seng and the Nikkei. The Kospi, though, bucking the trend, currently up by 0.5% right now. Well, before we go, here's a look at tomorrow's show. We'll discuss the biggest market risks and opportunities for 2025. And we're doing that with Zuma Wealth founder and CIO Terry Speth. Plus, we hear why MK Global Financial Services is taking a dimmer outlook on India's growth next year. That is it for Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.